I'm Charlie Stenholm. I have the privilege of being one of the three co-chairs of the Pew Foundation Commission on the Federal Budget. I want to begin by thanking the Pew Foundation and the Peterson Foundation for funding the effort. You have the first report of our effort thus far. It was handed to you as you check in. The rest of the plan begins, it began about 2 weeks ago with now the hard part, making the recommendations of how you should be able to balance the federal budget. Already had a couple of conversations with some that we've kind of been annual, perennial, whatever the next word is, at least the 31 years I've been around this town talking about the budget and the deficits and what we need to do about it. Seems that nothing seems to change except the problem gets worse. And I think there's now more of an agreement and an understanding by the American people that yes, it is possible that America is not too big to fail. When you start looking at the accumulation of debt as we are accumulating it over the last 10 years and the next 10 years, anyone that believes in the marketplace is coming around to saying it's kind of like, I guess it was Herb Stein. I like to quote Yogi Berra's version of it when he said it, that which cannot go on forever usually won't. And I think more and more are beginning to see that, and everybody knows what has to be done. You have to restrain spending, and you have to do it in the area where most of the spending is occurring, 40% of the budget that deals with the so-called entitlements. It shouldn't be that difficult, but in the political environment, it is seemingly impossible. And that's what we have elections for every 2 and 4 years and 6 years. And this November is going to be an interesting one. But I would just make one other comment. I've been of the opinion that the only way we're really going to solve this, or put another way, people ask me, said, well, Charlie, you've been up there a long time, and do you miss it? No, I don't miss the environment at all. But if there's one thing you could do, one thing and one thing only, what would you do? And I've always said that's easy. I would change the way in which we redistrict every 10 years. I would make sure that districts are drawn based on the people and not on the reelection of incumbents of both parties. We've all been guilty of that, and you just see what happened in Virginia this week in the editorial in the Washington Post this morning. If you think about it for just a moment, I had the privilege of representing a competitive district, and that made me have to listen to both sides. There are too many districts that do not have to listen to the ultra-right and the Republican Party and the ultra-left in my party. That's my offer for today as to what can be done. Now we're going to listen to the experts getting down in the mundane of actually talking about budget, the problem, the challenges we have, and how we go about it. With that, I'd like to introduce the president of our little effort here, Maya MacGuineas, who will introduce the first panel and get us off with the discussion. Thank all of you for being here.
Good morning, everybody. It's so nice to start a day with no snow, isn't it? I was panicked last night. Do our panelists want to come up and join us? Our three panelists, our fourth panelist is still stuck in traffic. So I'm Maya MacGuineas. I'm the president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, and I'm one of the members of the Peterson-Pew Commission on Budget Reform. For those of you who don't know, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, it's a bipartisan organization. Our co-chairs, you just met Charlie Stenholm, are Charlie Stenholm, Bill Frenzel, and Tim Penny, and the board of directors is made up of really the leading budget experts, the folks who've run the Congressional Budget Office, the Office of Management and Budget, Federal Reserve Board, the budget committees in Congress. So it's a wonderful group of people who lend their voice to reasonable budgeting. Unfortunately, sometimes when I mention the name, it's treated as a laugh line these days, but we're doing our best. And that's one of the purposes of this conference today. The Peterson-Pew Commission has really been a wonderful project so far, and it's going to continue for another year. This is a commission that was started by the Peter G. Peterson Foundation and the Pew Charitable Trusts to bring together these leading experts to really focus on the broken budget process. And the first report that we came out with, Red Ink Rising, we really turned our attention to focusing on the need for a fiscal goal. And that's one of the things that our first panel is going to talk about today, the importance of actually having an objective to which you're working for in writing our budget path or putting us back on a sustainable path. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to our C-SPAN viewers. I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists. We do have bio sheets available for everybody, and for C-SPAN viewers, if you go to our website, crfb.org, you can look at both the program and all the bios there. So today, we will shortly be joined by Doug Holtz-Eakin, who's stuck in traffic. He's a former director of the Congressional Budget Office and a president of the newly launched American Action Forum. We will start by hearing this morning from Rudy Penner, who is a former director of the Congressional Budget Office, and he recently co-chaired a very important study on choosing the nation's fiscal future that I hope he'll talk a little bit about today. He's also a board member of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget and commissioner of the Peterson-Pew Commission. John Podesta is the president and CEO of the Center for American Progress. He was the White House Chief of Staff for President Clinton, and he and some of his colleagues have done a great deal of important work of putting out ideas for a fiscal glide path to put us on a sustainable deficit path. And Bob Reischauer, former director of CBO. As you can see, we have a lot of CBO former directors who are part of our organization, is also the president of the Urban Institute. And we will be hearing from Rudy, Bob, and John. First, we'll hear from Doug when he comes, and there'll be time for questions and answers on all of our panels today. So once again, thank you for joining us. Rudy, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off.
Well, thank you, Maya. I thought Doug would make the case for having a target, but he's not here. But obviously, we should have one, a target that puts the budget on a sustainable path. It's obviously necessary to have a target to judge how we're doing, and so that the President and the Congress can be judged by the American people and held accountable. The only real question is, what should that target be? It's nostalgic to look back on the old days when the target was obvious. The budget should be balanced. And it was a target that served us well. It was adhered to for the first 175 years of our history, except in times of war or recessions. The rule was unquestioned intellectually, and it was an extremely powerful force. Recently been looking back at the 1950s to see when budgeting was a lot easier. And it was interesting to see Eisenhower terribly embarrassed by a deficit in 1959, which would amount to about $13 billion, as we now count it. And he was bound and determined to balance the budget the next year, and he and the Congress did just that. Admittedly, it wasn't real easy, and they used some budget gimmicks, but they did do it. And along the way, President Eisenhower said that he'd really like to provide a middle-class tax cut, but it was more important to balance the budget. What a quaint sentiment. Well, recently, as Maya said, I co-chaired a committee for the National Academies of Science and Public Administration, and our first task was to set a fiscal target. If we had chosen to target a balanced budget, we would have been laughed off the street because the policy changes required to do that today are so implausible politically. So the best we could do is enunciate a target of stabilizing the debt-GDP ratio, and then the question was, at what level? As you raise the target, the deficit coincident with stability rises, and with it the negative effects on our standard of living. And of course, as you raise the target, the risk of a meltdown in bond markets grows ever larger. But as you lower the target, the changes necessary to get there become more and more implausible. Well, we finally decided on 60%, not starting on a path toward it till 2012 so as not to dampen the economic recovery too soon, and we didn't suggest attaining the target till 2022. And if you look at our report, the policy changes to get there are really quite extraordinary. The American people today are not remotely prepared for the kinds of changes that are necessary. And when we add state and local debt to make our numbers comparable to those of Europe, anything higher puts us into territory where some developed countries have already gotten into trouble with their bond markets. We do have some room to go before we hit the Greek level of 120% of GDP, and they didn't get into big trouble until they lied about their budget situation. But wait, there is some analogy here. Our budget doesn't have Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac on it, even though it's owned lock, stock, and barrel by the American taxpayer. And then there's a little matter of over $3 trillion of mortgage-backed securities that they guarantee that appear neither on their balance sheet nor on the balance sheet of the U.S. government. Thank goodness the CBO does the accounting properly. Well, to sum up, we're living in dangerous time when the most ambitious target that we can hope for is to have a debt-GDP ratio stabilized at 60%. And frankly, we're a very long way from being able to even do that. Thank you.
Cheery, Rudy. Thank you. John, please.
Thanks, Maya. And I think, particularly when Doug gets here, the reason we're assembled here at this table this morning is to probably note that there's more agreement across the political spectrum of what the targets ought to be than there is the capacity of our political system to actually produce the results that would reach those targets. But I come to this from a couple of different perspectives. First, as someone who runs a think tank that believes in progressive policy solutions and investments, but also believes that if you don't get there within a fiscal framework that creates fiscal stability, that the pressures of the overall federal budget, the increase in interest payments on the debt, the instability that results from the federal balance sheet will squeeze out investments for the people that the country needs, that need them the most, on education, on the environment, on important programs that are there to build a strong middle class. And I think that today the real problem is that policymakers are faced with a very serious and very delicate challenge at this particular moment in trying to grapple with the problems that Rudy faced. Because the deficit outlook is truly dangerous in the long term. But we are also in the midst of a great recession. And the need to try to create the right balance, to thread that needle, I don't even know what the right analogy is any longer, to drive an aircraft carrier through the Panama Canal maybe. You have so little room on both sides to be able to make the short-term investments that will keep the recovery going, get job growth back into the economy is critical. And at the same time, there has to be a credible path towards a better fiscal position for the United States. And so I think that's really what the challenge is that the President's facing, that Peter Orszag, the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, are facing as they're trying to put this together to both apply an appropriate level of stimulus today, because if they don't do that, I think the prospect of job growth the prospect of potentially even a double-dip recession will increase, and that will, in fact, make it harder over the long run to address the deficit outlook over the next decade. But as I noted, large sustained budget deficits and high levels of government borrowing can make it politically more difficult to enact public initiatives. They siphon resources from public service to pay off interest on the debt. I think they leave the country unable to go further into debt at a time of crisis, and they'll ultimately lower future incomes. They'll raise interest rate. They'll spur inflation, make the economy more susceptible to the financial crisis going forward. I think we're seeing today what the future could hold if we don't get on top of this, and we're seeing it play out in Southern Europe as we look at what's happening in countries that are obviously not as strong as the United States. But that could be our future if we don't take action now. I think that the near-term deficits, let me step back for a second. I think that the problem, again, that we face today comes from two problems that are distinct but interrelated. One is what's happened over the last 8 years or the last period of time. I, of course, served in the Clinton administration at a time when we actually brought the government financial system into surplus. We had back-to-back surpluses over several years. I think that was the result of a lot of hard work and a lot of political courage in both parties. First, with the budget agreement that President George H.W. Bush entered into in 1990, followed by the budget plan that President Clinton entered into in 1993, which passed without a single Republican vote, and then the bipartisan agreement in 1997 that got us the rest of the way towards balance and surplus. But over the succeeding course of the administration, we saw the dramatic fiscal deterioration that was the result, I think, of deep tax cuts while we were running 2 wars and adding a substantial benefit to Medicare without paying for it. The other part of the long-term budget problem, though, really I think relates, as this group is analyzed, and it's fairly well known. I won't go into it in detail, but the aging of the baby boom and the inflationary costs of health care. Health reform is critical to containing costs and addressing this problem over the long term. And I assume, Maya, that we'll get into this in questions, so I won't go over it in detail. But I think that it is imperative that we begin to reform the way we deliver health care in order to get savings over the long term from the health care system, particularly in the public programs, but that's true in the private programs as well. We're going to need to reform the other entitlements, including Social Security. Maybe we'll get to that. I think we have, in my own view, we have an unsustainable path on the national security front. We're spending about, in real dollar terms, about nearly 50% more than at the peak of the Reagan buildup on defense. And if we don't, if one assumes that we're going to keep that rate going both from a fiscal perspective, and I think what it's doing to our overall armed forces, I think that's something that has to be addressed. We need a commitment to setting priorities and spending tax dollars on programs that work and are smarter and add productivity to the delivery of government services. Maya mentioned this at the center. We proposed that you could only manage this problem if you manage to a path. We saw that work, I think, during the course of the 1990s, where the combination of pay-go legislation and discretionary caps in the budget led to the first the reduction of the deficits and then surplus. At CAP, we've proposed an intermediate goal of primary balance by 2014. By that, we mean total revenues equal total spending except for debt service. That is, by 2014, the federal government should be, for every dollar of revenue taken in, should only pay for a dollar's worth of program based on a dollar worth of revenue taken in. And that we need to work the debt problem off over a longer period of time. We believe that you could balance the budget on that path by 2020. Those targets need to be supported, again, by a system of statutory mechanisms designed to enforce fiscal discipline and make it difficult for Congress to deviate from the path. PAYGO was just reenacted. We can discuss whether those changes need to be made. But hitting those requirements will require a lot more than just a cap on discretionary spending, particularly leaving out security spending. I think it'll require a new commitment that has to be enacted by Congress, and I'll end where I sort of began, which is this is not a problem of analysis. This is a problem of politics and a problem of the ability to find the will to get agreement to move the country back onto a more sustained path that will lead to stronger growth and greater opportunity for the American public.
Thank you, John. I think that all of these discussions are going to turn back to politics because that's so clearly sort of the toxic piece of all of this at the moment. We have a third panel today that's going to focus on the politics, and I've told them not only should they assess the situation, but they have to solve it. So that will be done by the end of the day. We're going to turn to Bob now, and then Doug, who of course has been fashionably late to this event, will go last and hopefully not repeat everything that has already been said. So Bob, please.
Well, thank you, Maya. I was intending to speak after everything had been said at least once. And so what I thought I would do was to try and place goals for our fiscal policy in the context of the 6 steps that we have to go through to reach a fiscally sustainable position. And those 6 steps in order are: first, convincing the public and their representatives that something has to be done. We're, of course, at a point where rhetorically that's is the case, but the next step, doing something, doesn't seem to be on the threshold. Second step is obviously to specify a goal. The third is to set a date to achieve that goal. The fourth is to establish some intermediary benchmarks or a path, as we've heard. Fifth is creating some mechanism that will encourage or force decision makers to take the necessary steps to reduce the deficit. And finally, there's the question of enforcement. Let me just say a word or two about each of these steps. The issue of convincing the public and their political leaders that something really has to be done is one that I don't think we have overcome at this point. There are really 4, it strikes me, arguments that one can make, and I will go from the better to the worse of the arguments in terms of what we'd like to see. The first, obviously, is the moral argument that we are, in a sense, doing to our children and our grandchildren what our parents and our grandparents didn't do to us. We're handing them a huge burden to pay for the public consumption that we've been unwilling to pay for ourselves. There's an international aspect to that, in the sense that as long as we run large deficits that are financed largely by foreign capital, we're draining capital that otherwise could be used to invest and raise living standards in countries less wealthy than ours, and that is not the way the world's supposed to work. The second argument or motivation for doing something would be because it benefits us, that we would be better off in the future, our GDP, our living standards, if we act to put our fiscal house in order. The third, and probably the one that will prove to be more convincing to the American people, is fear that there might be an economic collapse, high interest rates, inflation, collapse of the dollar, whatever, that the course we're on is too risky, and the way to avoid it is to step up to the plate. Fourth and finally, there is the issue of nationalism as an argument. We are on a path right now which will transform us, the largest military power in the world, into something of a fiscal slave to countries that may have very different views about political philosophy and very different geopolitical ambitions. Do we want to be a nation where before the president sees the Dalai Lama, or before we decide to send $10 billion worth of military aid to Taiwan, we have to sit down and think about what reaction there will be among our creditors. With respect to goals, they need to be understandable, and as Rudy pointed out, balanced budget was very understandable to the American people. The goals that we're talking about now, all three of the reports that have come out, are more complicated. They involve debt to GDP ratios, balance in the primary deficit, things that don't translate very well across the breakfast table in a discussion, let alone in committee hearings in Congress. They have to be attainable in the sense that they have to be politically attainable and economically attainable. We don't want to get ourselves trying for goals that would undermine the strength of our economy. And finally, they have to be flexible. All of the goals that have been set out so far have a degree of absoluteness to them, but we live in a very uncertain world where economic conditions can vary, where there can be wars, where natural disasters can strike, where there are inevitable economic cycles, and there has to be some kind of flexibility within the system one is designing. With respect to a date for achieving the goal, we all agree that getting to a fiscally sustainable position will take time, and given the current economic situation, it's going to take a good deal of time because we have to get the economy back on its feet. But whether the goal should be achieved in 2018 or 2020 or 2025, it's very hard to make a case one way or another, and this makes the whole challenge that much greater because procrastination and avoidance is really the things that this town does best. With respect to paths, that's also difficult because there are 1,000 roads that will get you to any particular goal, and there is no real consensus among our political leaders now about what would be an appropriate path or what the composition should be, how much taxes, how much spending, within spending, how much should come from entitlement programs versus other programs. With respect to mechanisms for forcing decisions, we have tried the normal legislative process, and it seems to have not responded. There are special procedures such as commissions or summit meetings, Graham-Rudman-Hollings type legislation, light item vetoes, enhanced rescission, and so on. And we have to think of what mechanisms are the most likely to produce some kind of packages that can bring the budget deficit down. Finally, with respect to enforcement, we have to have a mechanism that when the political process fails and the goals seem to be receding into the distant future, something happens. And the most promising of these, I think, is some kind of trigger mechanisms that, in a balanced way, increase tax revenue and reduce spending in ways that may not appear to be desirable, and so the Congress will be encouraged to find its own better solutions. This is a complex issue. There are lots of pieces that have to fit together, and I take some hope that many in this town have decided now is the time to begin the journey.
Thank you so much, Doug. I have already introduced you and mentioned your new venture, if you'd like to mention that as well, so please go ahead.
Thank you for the chance to be here today. I apologize for arriving late and under-caffeinated, a bad combination. But I don't want to attribute it to the profound ability of this town to procrastinate about even talking about this problem. I took my homework to be 3 questions. Does the U.S. need a fiscal goal first? Secondly, what should that goal be? And then lastly, and most difficult, how do we get this done? And let me touch on each briefly, and then we can turn to the discussion. First, I think it's transparent that the United States needs a fiscal goal. It has always been a source of amusement to our international colleagues when they visit the United States and they ask about how fiscal policy is set in the United States. When I have to explain to them that the United States doesn't have fiscal policies, it has fiscal outcomes. The House sort of does its thing, the Senate does its thing, they cobble together some sort of compromise, and the administration ultimately signs it. It wasn't really what they wanted to begin with. We have a series of budgetary outcomes that aren't reflective of any sort of plan. And it's obvious now we have to change the way we do our business. I won't belabor the dire nature of the outlook for the federal government budget, but I think it is very, very fair to say that if one looks at any realistic projection of the kinds of policies under which we are currently operating, we are endangering both our prosperity and our freedom. And this is something that is unwise in the most fundamental sense and unfair to the generations that will follow us. So I think we do need to have a fiscal goal. What a fiscal goal will do, if broadly adopted, is raise these considerations to a higher place in the pecking order and bluntly give policymakers a way to say no in a way that they simply cannot right now. Constituents come and have things they'd like to have happen. They sound like good things. Administration have things they'd like to do. They sound like good things. But they have to be good enough to trump the fiscal goal in order to be implemented. It gives you a way to say no that we currently do not have in the United States and which has put us in a very precarious position. So moving to a fiscal goal, moving to a situation where these considerations, the debt that we will leave behind, the rising level of spending that burdens our economy, these become more paramount in decision-making, I think, is an imperative. So I'm all for moving to something that gives us a fiscal goal in the United States. What should that goal be? Well, I have long advocated that the appropriate goal is a ratio of debt in the hands of the public to GDP. This is a sensible goal because the numerator, the debt in the hands of the public, is reflective broadly of the transactions of the federal government. How much money comes in, what spending goes out, what is borrowed as a result, and it accumulates over time. It's not sensitive to these year-to-year sorts of considerations that often undermine fiscal goals. The denominator is a broad measure of our economic performance, and we will have to place better economic performance at the centerpiece of moving forward and fulfilling our obligations to the next generations. So to have a goal that would, in the numerator, reflect how you're doing budgetarily, in the denominator, how those budgetary policies affect economic performance, I think is exactly the right thing. The trouble is there are about 4 people who care about debt to GDP, and selling it to the general public, I think, is going to be very, very difficult. And I want to come back to that because I think Bob Reischauer's point is exactly right. The educational aspect of this is an imperative. I think it would be important to translate those debt to GDP targets, stabilizing it, getting it lower, back into targets for taxes and spending, and in doing so, place the focus on the real problem in the federal budget, and that is the rate at which spending is increasing. There is no way to sugarcoat it. The United States will not be able to tax its way out of this problem. It will have to get its arms around, in a deep and substantive way, the spending programs in the federal government budget. And that hopefully will trigger a debate, a deep, important, and lasting agreement about what it is that the federal government will and will not do in this society. As a result, what transactions will and will not show up on its ledger, and how it will get its budgetary problems under control. So I think we need to focus on the debt to GDP, translate it into the levers that policymakers care about, and in doing so place a focus on the spending problem that the United States has. Once that happens, there are lots of enforcement mechanisms that can be brought to bear to help them stay on track. But the biggest thing is getting the basic decisions made and getting on track. So last question, how does this get done? Obviously, this is a very difficult problem. I think nothing happens without having our elected representatives go back to their home districts and have their constituents say to them, what are you going to do about this? This is unacceptable. And you know, you did a good job, thank you, when they make the hard decision to cut spending, raise taxes, or both. Until that happens, in a democracy of the type we live in, we're not going to make great progress. So we have to explain why this is a problem. We have to explain that it is in the interests of this society broadly to undertake rectifying this problem and have constituents reward their elected representatives for doing it. I also think there's a place for the kinds of nuts and bolts that dominate the discussion inside Washington. There's an important role for White House leadership. Regardless of who is currently residing in the White House, no major reform happens in the United States without presidential leadership. It is an imperative that this become the top focus of the President of the United States. It is our biggest problem. Nothing else should get in the way. And there has to be a way to have Congress change its way of doing business in order to grapple with these issues. The regular order has failed us. We've heard discussions of departures from regular order, whether they're commissions, special legislative procedures like reconciliation. I'm in favor of having the Congress change the way it does business in order to expedite the consideration of these bills, because that is part of placing a fiscal goal above the regular business as usual, and that's the paramount step that the Congress has to take. Now, there are obviously lots of details which we're happy to discuss, but I think doing this is an imperative, and finding ways to make it easier for our elected representatives to get it done is the most important job we face right now.
Good. Thank you so much to all four of you for those very sobering warnings, I think made all the more sobering by the remarkable backgrounds and experiences that all four of you bring to this, and the differing political viewpoints. It's one of the things we found on the Peterson-Pew Commission, that even though there was such a vast array of political perspectives, there was an awful lot of agreement on the need for a fiscal goal and what that fiscal goal should be and how to get there. And we've seen that in the subsequent reports that have come out. There's just so much agreement that it's time to focus on a fiscal goal and develop a glide path to get there. There's also widespread agreement that you want to announce that goal as quickly as possible and buy yourself some time to phase it in a little bit more gradually in order to not destabilize the recovery. I'm sure within this group there's a whole lot of disagreement about whether there should be additional stimulus between now and then, which is another topic. I'm going to ask one question, but because there's not much time, you may choose to answer it or not while I open it up to other people. I do think the fiscal goal is the critical first step. It allows you to say no. It allows you to sort of have comparisons of different policies to get there. But in the end, we can only avoid for so long the bottom line question of what policy changes are we going to make to change the budget situation. So I'd be curious if in your answers to other questions you choose to, you say sort of the one specific policy change you would like to see. And you can speak on behalf of yourself rather than your organization if that's useful. Right now, I'd love to open up. The audience is filled with remarkable budget experts, so I'm going to open it up to the folks here. Please weigh in the back, Krishna, and then Mort next. There are mics that are going around, so if you wait till the mic comes.
Thanks, Maya. Krishna Guha from the Financial Times. I wanted to ask the panel whether what we really need is an overall fiscal framework of the kind you described, or whether it's actually a fiscal framework for Medicare, in the sense that when you look at the long-run drivers, the contribution from Medicare is so great. Do we need actually to focus in on a fiscal framework, either capping the amount of spending relative to GDP on Medicare, a hypothecated tax to make the direct cost of this relevant immediately to public voters? How do you think about the Medicare component of this, and how does it relate to the overall strategizing about the budget?
So I have some sympathy for your analysis numerically. If you look at any of the projections done, for example, by the Congressional Budget Office, Medicare jumps out, along with Medicaid, quite frankly, as a driver of the long-run fiscal position. But I don't think that it makes sense from a political economy point of view to single out and say the problem is this program. and to rule out trade-offs between programs and to take off the table what is the commonly received and I think correct conclusion that everybody has to have some shared sacrifice in making tough decisions. So while I understand the numbers, I don't think you can make this a Medicare problem. It's a budget problem, and you have to really address it that way.
Moreover, in the next decade or so, it isn't all health. It is the retirement of the baby boomers, so you have to consider limiting Social Security growth as well. And I think as you try to do those things, you have to give some notion that the sacrifice is widespread and therefore have to look at other programs in the budget as well. And frankly, I don't think you can get much farther than 10 years than the kind of policies that we have now without provoking a crisis.
I guess I'm an outlier on this. I think it's the heart of the matter. I was going to answer, if you had to make one change to Maya's question, what would it be? It has to be in the delivery of health care. We're spending 17.5% of GDP on health care. The OECD average is about half that. The next country, Switzerland, is 11%. We're headed to 20. It's going to bankrupt the country if we don't reform the way we price and deliver health care, reduce errors in hospitals, do the kinds of things that I think there's again broad spread agreement on with respect to driving change away from a system that rewards the volume towards one that rewards value. And I think if we don't do that, then Medicare is going to go bust. And I think more importantly, the country, businesses, American families can't really afford the system that we currently have. So hope springs eternal that there will still be change driven on the healthcare agenda this year. Maybe we'll all be surprised, and there'll be some agreement in the summit that will take place next week between Republicans and Democrats at the White House. But if we don't get on top of this, I think, and isolate and drive change and reform in the healthcare system, I think that this challenge and this problem is just insurmountable.
Just to give John some solace that he's not an outlier, I basically agree with him, and the point he's making is you can't solve the healthcare problem, which is nationwide, by tinkering around or even radical changes within the Medicare program alone. You have to restructure the way we pay for and deliver health care in the country at large. The other point I would make is that even if there were nothing wrong with our overall fiscal situation, we would see an increase in retirement-related expenditures, and we should see that given the demography, given the nature of the programs, and a shrinkage in a relative sense of these other programs. So you don't want to go in and just sort of say, well, we're going to solve this whole thing on the back of Medicare, because if we look at the numbers, Medicare or Medicare and Medicaid are the source of this problem. We, as the nation matures, we're going to redistribute public expenditures in a way towards the aged, and that's unavoidable.
Great, thank you. Morton Kondracki.
Morton Kondracki, roll call. Since your report came out in December, we've obviously had the president's budget and his roadmap for the future fiscally. Would you evaluate it in terms of how close to the goals that you cite it comes?
Should we start at that end of the table?
Evaluate it, B minus. You know, they're, you know, the basic outline I think is appropriate, but once again, we reach out for, in the sense of magic asterisk, in the form of a commission to get to the goal that the president has laid out. think all of us at this table have a more aggressive goal and path, but you know, this is really the first indication that a president is willing to go out and endorse a particular goal and path for the future.
Is there in fact a goal in the budget?
Yes. Well, maybe I just answer the question and incorporate it into my answer. There's some things I like and there's some things I don't like more. I think that they bit the bullet on the high-end tax cuts and argued that they should be allowed to expire this year, not pushing that down the road. If you look at the budget path over the course of the next 10 years, they don't achieve, I think, what all of us think is necessary, which is a stable debt to GDP ratio, except through the use of the commission, which the president intends to execute by executive order, having been voted down in the Senate. Another casualty of our broken politics, I think. But the charge they're making to the commission is the one that I mentioned, which is they delay it a year from what we proposed, but primary balance by 2015, which stabilizes the debt to GDP ratio. They do about half the work to get there, but half the work remains to be done through a bipartisan process. And the one thing I think that I've been critical of is limiting the discretionary cap to the so-called domestic side of the agenda. I mean, I think if you and not extending that to a very wide swath of spending that is called security spending under the budget. You know, if that had been limited to supporting the troops in the field in Afghanistan and Iraq, I think one could argue that would have been not only sensible, necessary. But if anybody thinks that every dollar at the Department of Homeland Security is being well spent and therefore no budget discipline should be applied to that, it seems to me it just takes you down the wrong track. And I think that from an overall perspective, I think they would have been wise to try to execute something the President talked about during the campaign, which is an overall national security budget, so that trade-offs are made within the national security programs, and that the necessary funding to support our the ground force that is deployed in Afghanistan is put up against other trade-offs, particularly within the defense budget, but across the security budget overall.
Our committee took on the challenge of actually specifying various policy packages that would get you to a 60% debt GDP ratio. And I must say, after 40 years or so of messing around with budgets in this town, I was shocked at how dramatic those policy changes had to be. And I think the great problem today is that the American people aren't hearing a thing about the kind of dramatic changes that will be necessary to stabilize the situation. They certainly didn't hear about it in the President's budget. And we've got to start the groundwork of preparing them very quickly, even if we're to start on this path as early as 2012, which we suggested, and you've got to start on it pretty soon. So I didn't mean in my answer to the last question that there don't have to be changes in Medicare. They do, very substantial changes. There have to be changes in Social Security as well, or else there has to be massive tax increases of a sort that aren't really imaginable in this country. So that's the work that has to be started, and I just don't see it being done yet.
I want to echo what Rudy said. I found the combination of the President's budget and the economic report of the President disappointing, not just in the numbers, which were bleak and make no progress toward our problems, but in the nature of the solutions which are trotted out. Commission, let them go solve with a magic asterisk. If you look at the budget chapter in the economic report of the President, they hold out the hope for a healthcare reform, which in some sort of particle physics theoretical way is supposed to solve our problems, but where if you look at the actual bills that have come through the actual Congress, they actually make things worse, according to independent evaluations. So let's move to the next solution, waste, fraud, and abuse. We've heard that before, bipartisan solution that does very little. And then the high-end tax cuts, which is a trivial amount of money and which is at odds with their rhetoric about how you can't do these things in a recession. We certainly couldn't cut spending. So I think the idea that somehow any Congress can move quickly and dramatically enough to endanger the economic recovery is ludicrous. And to send a message that you can't touch some of these things because of the recovery, I think is missing the point. You need to put into the President's budget serious policies to take on a serious problem. You need to echo them in the reports of their economic advisors. And I think these didn't do that.
There's a question right there.
Dan O'Connor, Education Center. You all say something about the rhetoric of informing the public. I've been particularly interested in Medicare. As you know, the experts over the years have said to save Medicare, we'll have to either double taxation or cut benefits in half. Do you think we should tell the public very bluntly the truth or do it diplomatically and slowly?
I think we ought to scare them to death. I mean, it's a serious issue. And the notion that somehow we have to diplomatically explain that we're robbing their children's future, I think entirely misplaced. There are too many Americans who believe if we just cut out foreign aid, the budget balances. There's an enormous misunderstanding of the nature of the problem. I think my experience in the chatter that surrounds policy debates in a political environment is that you have to say one thing very, very clearly 100 times a day for it to penetrate the public consciousness. So I am in favor of taking the gloves off and leveling with American people.
And if you want to scare them, just have them look at Southern Europe. Look at what's happening in Ireland with huge cuts in civil service pay, with dramatic cuts in social programs, tax increases and spending cuts that amount to 5% of the GDP, I guess more than that. These are the kinds of things that lie in our future if we don't do anything about the problem.
Gosh, excuse me. I was going to take two questions up here, and then we'll let the panel have their last comments with the answers to those two.
Hi, Jessica. I'm on Dean Size. A question about this public information. I think you've all spoken about the notion that the macro numbers, we're probably a macro crowd in here, are hard to convey. I'm wondering if a better approach would be Social Security sends every year a letter to every future Social Security recipient saying what their benefits will be and explaining at different ages. Shouldn't we, or might we consider, would it be effective to send every Medicare recipient in the United States a tally every year of their lifetime balance of Medicare use? And maybe even consider, although I don't think it would be much revenue raising given poverty in America, but maybe even consider linking it to an estate tax so that we agree we want every elderly person to be taken care of in their lifetime, but we're going to tell them how much their lifetime expenditures are, and then if they're left with some substantial amount of money, we're going to claim that back for the next generation. I mention that also because I don't actually think that it's just the older generation that's benefiting from this. I think you have a lot of interest in the generation behind them in protecting the family's money intergenerationally, so that whatever the U.S. government will pick up, either in Social Security or in Medicare, is an easy benefit to the family in terms of not having to save for intergenerational care.
Thank you. Let me try to slip in one additional question that was right here. Oh, both of you have questions? You have two quick questions.
Thank you. Norman Bailey, President of the Institute for Global Economic Growth. It is traditional, but I think unfortunate, that the discussion was centered on spending and very little discussion of production. There are, after all, two ways to improve the debt-GDP ratio. And I would like to hear a lot more discussion about how to increase production, entrepreneurship, the widespread public ownership of productive assets and matters of that kind, and not entirely on how we can reduce the increase in spending and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Great, I'm going to make the next panel answer that one as well. If you can, there's one more question here, Damien, and then we'll do a quick summary.
Yes, Norman Curlin from the Center for Economic and Social Justice. I want to amplify the point by Dr. Bailey and say that maybe we have to look at goals beyond the Keynesian box, and that is not only full employment and balancing the budget, but also thinking in terms of full production, full employment, full ownership, and full economic empowerment of the people through widespread ownership of future capital.
Thank you. Okay. Everybody can weigh in on any of the questions and their final last words.
Well, briefly, I mean, I think that's the desirability of the debt to GDP formulation, which is if you have two equivalent policies that produce the same net debt, but one is pro-growth, it will look better using that formulation, and that's the one that we should choose as a society. So I'm all in favor of that sentiment. Getting the policymaking apparatus there, I think, is the key. With regard to information statements, I think it's good to inform the public, but sending someone a statement without changing the incentives, their ability to understand their healthcare choices, get higher quality outcomes for less money, I think misses the fundamental problems with Medicare, which is a deeply broken system and needs to be reformed. So, and until we reform it, quite frankly, it will continue to grow. And because it will continue to grow, even a one-time wealth confiscation to pay off the cumulative debt will not solve the problem for the future. We need to solve the problem. And I think that's the message that should come out of events like this, that we have deep problems rooted in our federal entitlement programs, that they need to be addressed, that they are driving us to a position where we endanger the next generation's freedom from international pressures and their basic prosperity. And it's time to get down to business.
And I agree that we should be looking at the tax side too. It's a situation that just cries out for tax reform when we have to figure out how to deal with the AMT, how to deal with the extension of the Bush tax cuts. And if you were to broaden the base, especially if you were to cap the exclusion for health insurance, you can generate enormous amounts of revenue, raise the same revenue we're doing today with much, much lower tax rates, and that would be really conducive to economic growth.
Well, let me say one point of disagreement with Doug, which he said that the problem is all on the spending side. The problem is also on the revenue side. In 2009, we had our receipts were the lowest they've been since 1950. After the president's budget is fully enacted, the revenue figures as a percentage of GDP will be about 2% lower than they were under President Clinton at the end of his administration. Now, I might be nostalgic, but I remember pretty strong growth in the 23 million jobs that the United States created. Probably we had growth that was twice as large as under the succeeding 8 years. So I think that this question of how you get revenue and what the nature of reform to produce that revenue ought to be front and center. And I agree with Rudy that we can have a system that actually potentially has, particularly on the corporate side, that could lower the rate by getting rid of a number of the tax expenditures that are currently bogged down the code, which have the same effect as spending, but spending on special interest rather than the public interest. And do that in a way that produces fundamental tax reform, that produces revenue that is necessary to support the important innovations that need to be powered, I think, through investments, particularly in education, and having a strong ability to create the human capital that's going to produce the ownership and innovation that you discussed. With respect to the other question, I'm for more transparency than less, but I think this is a place where I do agree with Rudy. I don't think the transfer mechanism works very directly because it breaks down the insurance system that that ought to be the central feature of Medicare.
A couple of points. With respect to the transparency issue, I think Social Security sends everybody a statement that says what their benefits will be under certain assumptions, but it doesn't highlight the fact that in 2037 or whenever the trust fund runs out of money, there is a high probability under current law that benefits will be reduced ratably by about 27%. That might scare some people. It might not. We all know that when you go around and ask 35-year-olds, you know, will Social Security be there when you're 62? They all say no. So if they really believe that, this won't really affect their behavior or their willingness to sacrifice. I don't think at all. With respect to Medicare, you could send beneficiary statements saying how much medical care they used, and what you would be doing is largely sending big, scary notices to very sick, very old people. You know, then the second part of that was, and we could institute a pay-as-you-go tax, in other words, from your estate, try and recoup some of that, but the vast majority of people with any kind of sensible exemption wouldn't have anything to transfer. So, you know, I don't think that's really a way to go. With respect to, you know, shouldn't we be more concerned about economic growth and pushing that forward? Yes, we should. It's not like there's a magic elixir that we know we can pull out of our pocket and sprinkle on the economy and cause growth to surge. The thing that we should be doing is investing more in high-quality education, research and development, to do a lot of that. Maybe some deregulation is in order, but also, as we've seen in the past, this takes public resources, and public resources are what we're a little shy of right now.
So let me just mention a couple points that I heard to end with. So one that was made was that the president's budget needs to go farther than it does, and I think the administration was quite clear in saying that this is sort of their first step. It is going to need to go farther. But one piece that's missing is sort of a public awareness of just what that means, exactly the types of policies that are going to have to be involved. And for any of us or you who have gone through that exercise of trying to pick a fiscal goal and achieve it, it really does take some very dramatic measures. And then finally, I think this point about economic growth is such a critical one, that while everything's going to have to be on the table and most everything's going to have to be part of an ultimate budget deal, is my prediction, you want to think about it carefully in ways that are conducive to economic growth. So when you're looking at taxes, we want to consider fundamental tax reform as well as tax increases. When we're looking at spending, we want to think about protecting the areas of the budget that are the most productive in terms of public investment, and that's also going to require shifting away from a lot of parts of the budget that focus on consumption. So I may have just said some things the panelists don't agree with, but I think those are important themes to think about going forward. Thank you so much to a wonderful panel. I really want to thank all of you. As they leave, what I